During the Democratic primary leading up to the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden was getting a lot of heat, a lot of backlash for promoting, assisting, being a part of the 1994 crime bill that at the time President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, signed into rotation. He was getting a lot of backlash for that because that bill ended up incriminating and incarcerating a lot of people of color. So hindsight is 2020. During that primary, there were different moments where Joe Biden, who ended up becoming the Democratic nominee, his opponents thought it was good to bring that crime bill up, and of course Joe Biden had to step back, and he apologized for being a part of that 1994 crime bill and being one of the key people to promote it and to get it passed. And I understand, because that bill ended up doing some long-term damage, in particular to people of color. But I remember that bill in real time, because around that mid-90s is when I really started diving into politics and following politics, and specifically on a national level. And one key thing about that crime bill, which is not being presented now in 2020 and not being talked about, which I understand because that's not really the point. But I do remember that crime bill was actually effective in the first year or two that it was passed. It did what it was supposed to do very early on, but it was quickly becoming an issue, I would say maybe year 2.5 years in, because one of the factors, and there were many, but one of the factors was that people were getting incarcerated for as little as like a dime bag of weed. So, and then that curtailed, and there was different layers to that, and it ended up being people were long-term incarceration for very minimal things. So that was one of the driving points to getting to finding a way to get around that bill, to cancel that bill. But about 4 or 5 years into that, that's when the argument started brewing about that particular bill. So I say that to say, moving forward from 2020 on, and particularly into 2021, when we get a new administration, a new federal government, White House administration, maybe, or if we continue to have the one we have now, if there are bills that are going to be drafted, specifically when it comes to criminal bills similar to the 1994 crime bill, and I'm going to assume with all this social unrest that we've had during the summer of 2020, we will have bills and legislation built around that, in particular to police brutality and things of that level, things of that nature on the federal level. I would take heed and say the real issue with this legislation and bills like the crime bill is that it didn't evolve. Like the crime bill in 1994, it was good for a moment. Then it quickly kind of outdated itself when things started going left and started going right, and it did not stick right down the middle. Key in point, people getting arrested for carrying dime bags of weed, and they're in jail for months. Some cases, people are in jail for years for technicalities on small possession of drugs. So I would say moving forward, when these type of bills and legislation is being drawn up and they go into effect, here's the key point: they need to be amended every few years, because times change, things change, momentum, atmosphere, in terms of what's happening, in particular when it comes to crime and incarceration. So what happens and what's good for now with a crime or bill, a bill or legislation, it might not be the case 2 years in, 3 years in. So these bills need to be amended, just like the 1994 bill. If it had been continuously amended through the years and stayed up to date in terms of maybe edited, or things being removed or things being added to, amended, then you might have a sort of legislation or bill that can continue to work for the people and for communities and for cities in this country, in this nation, United States of America. So that is where I think the points are not being talked about when we look back at that crime bill. It quickly got outdated, but if you have amendments, if Congress is bringing that bill up, or any bill moving forward now, every few years, then you can add to or subtract, and that bill can continue to be effective.